June 1st, 1986, seemed like any other day when 16-year-old Elaine Doyle ventured out to the Greenock Celtic Supporters Club with her friends for a fun-filled night. Little did she know that this would be her last outing. The club, which was founded as a charitable organization for the underprivileged in Glasgow's East End, became the setting for a harrowing tragedy that night. In the quiet town of Greenock, Scotland, Elaine went missing without a trace, leaving her family entirely oblivious of the impending tragedy. The next morning, the town awoke to the sight of police cars and rumbling of sirens, as everyone grappled with the question of what could have happened to this young woman during that brief 15-minute walk from the club to her home. How did a night of fun turn into a tragic and unsolved mystery? Did someone intentionally target Elaine? And if that was the case, what could someone possibly have against a teenage girl? Elaine was the beloved daughter of Maureen and Jack Doyle, and had only one sibling, a brother named John. She was a bright, future-focused young girl with a positive outlook on life. When she went missing at the age of 16, she was already working at a jewelry shop. She had a large circle of friends because of her friendly and welcoming demeanor. Yellow was her favorite color. Therefore, among her friends on the Citizens Band called Radio, she was referred to as the Golden Girl. Together with the same friends, Elaine went on a night out at the Greenock Celtic Supporters Club on June 1st, 1986. She frequently volunteered at social clubs like this one because of her kind heart and amiable personality. That day, she told her mum that she was going to be home late, maybe around midnight, but when she failed to show up, even after the scheduled time, Maureen relied on her daughter's judgment and presumed that Elaine had spent the night at a friend's place. Not until June 2nd in the morning will the family get the heartbreaking news. The sight of multiple police cars parked outside in the neighborhood greeted Maureen as she lifted the curtains of her living room. She later found out that one of the neighborhood's residents had, on his 7:30 a.m. walk, discovered a body discarded on a lane across Argyle Street, where Elaine used to live. Given that it was a small and tight-knit community, he recognized Elaine's face right away. Horrified of the finding, he immediately called the cops. Now it was left to the authorities to break the devastating news to the family. The identification of the lifeless body left the family crushed. No parent ever deserves to see their children in the state in which Elaine's body was discovered. She was entirely naked, with only a bra strapped to her arm. Her clothing, though, were nicely folded and placed next to her. The authorities believed that strangulation was the most likely cause of death, as evident from the bruises on her neck. Furthermore, the presence of a black eye prompted the detectives to speculate that Elaine had retaliated against her assailant. Their suspicions were validated when they received the autopsy report, mentioning suffocation from strangling by ligature to be the declared cause of death. The autopsy results implied that Elaine was likely strangled when she was facing down, and the person who did it tightened the ligature behind her neck. Moreover, DNA evidence was found on Elaine's face and chest by the medical examiner Pauline McSorley, who performed the autopsy. Chunks of hair and broken bracelet pieces were also discovered close to the body. The investigators' theory that there had been a physical altercation between the perpetrator and the victim was further supported by the existence of significant bruises and defensive marks. Sadly, there had been an improper handling of the crime scene, with the evidence being carelessly dealt with and without safety equipment. Consequently, more than 41 samples of DNA were discovered at the scene, all of which were cleared with the exception of one. The remaining missing sample was thought to belong to the offender. The investigators were able to track Elaine's whereabouts up until midnight, when she was with her friend Lynn McCurdy, by interviewing her friends from the neighborhood. They were the last people known to have seen Elaine alive, having parted ways with their other friends so they could get hamburgers. Following that, none of her friends claimed to have seen her again. Around 12:40 on the midnight, a local girl reported hearing loud screams, but the authorities were unable to obtain any other pertinent information. Given the intensity of the attack and the degree of assault, the motive behind the attack was believed to be of sexual nature. On June 9th, outside the White Library on Union Street, a police officer found Elaine's purse. There were signs of attempts of destroying potential evidence, as the bag had been severely burnt. The Elaine Doyle's cold case is widely regarded as one of the most thorough manhunts in Scottish history. It entails interviewing a great deal of people and creating a suspect list with over 700 names. The perpetrator could not be identified by the detectives in spite of their best efforts. No closer are the authorities to solving the horrific crime, despite following up on a number of leads and interviewing suspects. Over time, no further leads could be materialized, and the investigation became cold. As the years went on, the community as a whole, including Elaine's parents, anxiously waited for answers. Hope started to wane as the case continued to remain a bewildering mystery. But when detectives came across the old case files in 2012, about 28 years after Elaine's passing, new interest in the case was sparked. They learned that a person of interest listed in the files, John Docherty, had never been interrogated. On the night of the tragedy, he had been mentioned by multiple witnesses who had seen him close to the crime scene. The detectives got hooked by this information and made the decision to look into it more. After more investigation, they discovered that Docherty had even been referenced in his statement from the original investigation, but he had never been interrogated for reasons not specified. Given the considerable amount of time that had passed, the investigators were not expecting much, but they felt obliged to talk to him to tie up loose ends. At first, Docherty, who was 21 at the time of the incident, said he was at his parents' home on Greenock. He did, however, finally confess to being at the disco the night of the incident when questioned by the authorities more. Docherty complied with the police's last request, which was for a DNA sample that he willingly gave. As soon as the authorities entered the information into the database, the shock was profound. John Docherty's DNA was discovered to be an exact match to the samples collected from Elaine Doyle's body and the crime scene. Docherty was born in 1964 and currently resided in Dunoon, Argyll, Scotland. He was a soldier before he retired and started working as a bus driver. Having a daughter and a committed partner, his life appeared to be normal at first sight. But all of that was going to change when his previous actions finally caught up with him. Docherty was quickly detained once his DNA was confirmed, and on June 17, 2014, he was found guilty following a 52-day court trial. The prosecution was led by John Scullion. Because of the nature and extent of Elaine's injuries, investigators were able to compile sufficient evidence. They asserted that she had been grabbed by her hair by force, knocked over by hitting on the head, and then dragged into the lane where she was assaulted and later discovered. The suspicion that Docherty had been with her on that tragic night was further strengthened by the discovery of his DNA at the crime scene. The prosecution presented a vivid depiction to the jurors, recreating the events of the incident by a compelling narration. They established that Elaine was taken by surprise by Docherty, who then took off her clothes and used the ligature to strangle her from behind, while she lay face down on the ground. Luckily, the authorities were able to track down a witness named Martin Brown, who stepped forward to testify and lend more credibility to the prosecution's case. Brown claimed that he had seen Docherty trailing behind Elaine into the lane, looking frustrated. All of these accusations were denied by John Dougherty, who hired Q.C. Donald Finley as his defense attorney to represent him. Finley skillfully countered the DNA evidence, claiming that it was insufficient and unreliable as a source of proof. He argued that there was an elevated likelihood of contamination or tampering, since the evidence had been stored for over 2 decades. Considering all of the missteps that occurred whilst dealing with Elaine's case, the defense's argument was compelling. It was later found that the investigators had neglected to wear protective clothing while gathering evidence, in addition to lacking the necessary forensic tools and expertise to operate at a crime scene at the time of the incident. Moreover, there was doubt raised about the credibility of the witness's testimony. The eyewitness in question, Martin Brown, was colorblind when instructed to look at black and white pictures of people that looked like the offender. He managed to rule out all but 3 of them, first naming somebody else in his statement before finally settling on John Dougherty. Brown's credibility was further questioned once he disclosed that it had taken him over a decade to come forward with the information, because he had just recently recognized Elaine's face in a newspaper and realized she was the same woman he had seen that night. The defense contended that it was unfair to hold Dougherty accountable, since the news of a compromised crime scene had not been announced before the trial. They suggested that the case's investigating officers were careless and might have mismanaged the DNA sample, which could have contaminated it, yielding a match with Dougherty. Their claim, nevertheless, was quickly disregarded when the crime scene's forensic specialists testified that the DNA recovered was 560,000 times more inclined to belong to Dougherty than to any other man. In the end, the jury rejected the defense and ruled in favor of the prosecution, pronouncing John Dougherty guilty by a majority verdict. Thanks to DNA evidence, the perpetrator in this case was finally found after over 3 decades, making it one of the longest-lasting cases in Scotland. In 2014, an Edinburgh High Court ultimately found Dougherty guilty, and Lord Advocate Frank Mulholland condemned him to life sentence with a minimum of 21 years in prison. By highlighting the heinousness of the crime, Mulholland justified the harsh sentencing. Elaine Doyle's brother, John Doyle, voiced his opinion that the sentence was appropriate and just. He went on to say that even though it took a long time to get his sister justice, they were relieved that she could finally be at peace. He spoke for his mother, saying although the loss of a loved one never really goes away, the case's outcome gave them some hope amidst their grief. The family conveyed their gratitude for the suspects' capture, stating it provided them with a sense of resolution. Yet in 2012, Jack, John Doyle's 17-year-old son, was fatally stabbed in Greenock, adding to their already profound suffering. John's father, whose name was also Jack, could not cope with the loss of his grandson and passed away too, further exacerbating John's profound grief. Even with the tremendous pain he had to bear, he continued to be grateful that at least one of the perpetrators had been arrested and convicted. On the night of June 2, 1984, a passerby frantically dialed 911, reporting a fierce fire at a quiet apartment building in Everett, Washington. The air was thick with tension as firefighters raced to the scene, breaking down the door to a shocking discovery: the lifeless, bound body of Judy Weaver. What exactly transpired in that building? And who was Judy Weaver? Growing up, Judy Weaver lived in Everett, Washington. At the age of 17, she had won a local beauty contest. Judy, at 42 years old, co-owned the Bellness Cafe on Hewitt Avenue in Everett in 1984. She had 2 adult daughters, Colleen, who was 23 years old and resided in North Pole, Alaska, and Kathy, age 20 years old, residing in Washington. Kathy, as well as Judy's mother, Edith, worked at the cafe alongside her. Recently, Judy became a grandma and joyously announced the arrival of her grandson Levi by hanging banners around her cafe displaying the words, "It's a boy." In Everett, the local Salty Sea Days festival was coming to an end on the evening of June 1st, 1984. After finishing work, Judy left the Bellness and headed on her way to home. About half a block from her residence, a witness spotted her at the Dairy Queen. On her way home from work, she would frequently stop there to get vanilla ice cream. Unbeknownst to her, it would be the last time she stopped by there. On June 2nd, shortly after midnight, a bystander contacted 911 using a payphone and reported a fire at the one-story, 5-unit brick apartment building on the junction of 35th Street and Rucker Avenue. It was Judy's apartment from which most of the smoke was coming out. Upon entering the building, firefighters were shocked to discover Judy's lifeless body inside. She was restrained, tied up with a phone wire, pantyhose, and cloth. Judy had been slain by strangulation, and a knife had been used to tear through her clothing. The fire was only restricted to her bedroom. Firefighters concluded that Judy's bed was where the fire originated, using paper towels and a jar of Pond's cold cream. The rear door of the unit had been opened. For decades, the case stayed cold. In 2002, detectives gave it another look. At the time, a suspect was named. However, upon more investigation, he was exonerated. The arrest in Judy's case finally occurred on May 1st, 2024, nearly 4 decades after her passing. That day, in relation to Judy's case, Mitchell Gaff, aged 66, was arrested in Olympia, Washington, and charged with first-degree slaying, first-degree arson, first-degree burglary, first-degree assault, and first-degree kidnapping. Gaff's identity was determined via DNA evidence. In the year 2023, the cloth that had been tied around Judy's hands had been re-examined. After a DNA profile was discovered and analyzed via the Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, Gaff came out to be a possible match. In order to verify the match, more samples were required. Therefore, undercover police investigators discreetly retrieved discarded items that included Gaff's saliva. Subsequently, the DNA sample was compared by the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab to samples from a vaginal swab collected during Judy's autopsy, 3 pieces of clothes she wore the night she was slain, and the ligatures that were utilized to restrain and strangle her. Gaff's DNA profile was stored in the system due to his decades-long state-mandated imprisonment and lengthy history of sexual transgressions, given that he had been labeled as a sexual sadist by the state therapists. In 1979, Gaff attacked a woman while she was putting away her lawnmower, marking the beginning of his documented criminal activities. He pushed her to the ground, restrained her hands, struck her with a pistol several times, and threatened to sever her throat. He attempted to assault her, but she fought him off bravely and managed to get away. Gaff was found guilty of both burglary and assault. Due to this attack, he was placed on probation. At the time of Judy's death, Gaff was 26 years old and was employed as a carpet cleaner, residing in Everett with his parents. A couple of months later, he attacked 2 teenage sisters after breaking into a residence at night. He restrained them and viciously assaulted both of them in front of one another before one sister managed to flee and get help. 1985 saw him enter a guilty plea to 2 counts of first-degree assault and first-degree burglary and receive a sentence. A jury decided in 1995 that he ought to be admitted for treatment at the state's Special Commitment Center on McNeil Island. In 2000, a different jury reached the same conclusion. Throughout these trials and his commitment, Gaff confessed to 5 additional assaults as well as his previous attempts of attacking up to 30 women a day for a time period. Additionally, he admitted that after he took Judy's life in the summer of 1984, his compulsions grew more aggressive and that he took pleasure in severing his victim's clothing with a knife, just as he did with Judy's. In the early 2000s, there were numerous attempts of releasing Gaff back into the society, but his non-compliance with his terms kept him incarcerated. Not until 2018 did he receive his unconditional release. By that time, he had legally changed his name as well. As of right now, Gaff is being detained without bail. If you find this video compelling, show your support by giving it a thumbs up, subscribing to our channel, and ringing that notification bell. By doing so, you'll stay updated about the latest investigations and mysteries. Your support means the world to us as we continue to pursue the truth in the world of cold cases.